Hi, welcome to our online lecture on cross-cultural communication in class. As you're probably aware, National Taiwan University has a lot of international students from different countries, and they participate in all kinds of classes as well as campus activities. Communicating with international students can be challenging, not just because we might speak different languages and English could be the native language for none of us, but also because we were born and raised in different cultural backgrounds, which will affect how we think, how we speak, how we behave, and our value system. The interplay of language and cultural factors creates a complex environment where both the international students and their peers, including you, the TA, need to exercise patience, open-mindedness, and a willingness to learn from each other. In this lecture, we are going to discuss 3 cultural differences that may be particularly prominent and important in the classroom setting. We'll start with the different attitudes towards silence and speaking and touch a little bit about the differences when we do speak. Then we're going to move from the verbal to the nonverbal aspects and talk about the differences between contact and non-contact cultures in terms of eye contact and proximity. The last part will be about the values we hold, specifically the perception of power distance. We will end this lecture with some suggestions for your future interaction with international students and Taiwanese students alike. When it comes to the attitudes towards silence and speaking, the East Asians very often hold a drastically different perspective from students from, say, North America and some European countries. Specifically, the East Asians' attitude towards silence can be captured in this saying, "Silence is gold," sometimes followed by "Speech is silver." And tracing back to its historic origins, you will notice that the traditional cultural values shared by Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, which were critical in shaping a lot of East Asian cultures, such as Japanese and Taiwanese, all value internal introspection and being thoughtful before speaking. Therefore, for those cultural groups, silence is a very, very important part of any conversation. Not only because it helps regulate the flow of the conversation by serving as a nonverbal cue to signal topic changes or even conversation dynamics shift, but also because silence may convey the signs of respect, wisdom, or contemplation. On the contrary, speaking or speaking too much could be considered as the opposite of these positive features. Many idioms support this attitude towards silence. For instance, the Japanese likes to say, "It is what people say that gets them into trouble." And there's a Taoist saying, "One who speaks does not know." This favorable attitude towards silence does not just prevail in the East Asian groups. Some Finnish people also believe the power of silence when they say a loud voice shows an empty head. The fact that East Asian and Finnish people value silence over speaking very often leads to their indirect and high context communication style. Communication style is the verbal and nonverbal ways of people using language. For people who are high context communicators, most of the information they want to send to whomever they are talking to is either embedded in the physical context or already internalized in the conversation participants. This means high context communicators do not heavily rely on the verbal message itself to say what he or she wants to say. In other words, they convey the meaning through shared experiences, implicit messages, nonverbal cues, and the context of communication at that moment. An example of high context communication would be, let's say, a group of students chit-chatting loudly in the library, and another student, Jack, might feel distracted by their loud voices. So Jack decides to look at the talking students and expects that when they notice that he's looking at them, maybe a little bit angrily, they will stop talking. In this example, Jack is not directly and verbally telling the students to keep their voices down, but instead, he's using nonverbal eye contact to deliver the message. He expects that, as students, they will share with him the understanding that we should not talk so loudly in library because other students might get distracted. Now, the attitude towards speaking in silence is very much different for people from North America or some European countries. If we were to capture their attitude using one saying like we did for the East Asians, it would be the squeaky wheels get the oil. This means for people with this cultural background, speaking is part and parcel in their life, inside or outside the classroom. Again, this attitude has its historic origins. In ancient Greece, a citizen must learn how to speak and persuade others. Rhetorics is an essential skill and art for them, and agoras have been built to encourage citizens to deliver public speeches to the audience. Consequently, cultures that have been heavily influenced by the Greek and Roman civilization also perceive speaking as a highly valued skill, sometimes even to the point that silence is interpreted as negative or even hostile behavior. Now, just like the fact that we often see people who value silence as indirect or high context communicators, people who are a pious follower of speaking tend to be more direct and low context when they communicate with other people because they believe explicitly speaking something out can solve many problems. Being a direct and low context communicator means that most of the information they want to send out is largely embedded in the verbal message itself. The message can be oral or it can be textual, but either way, the message clearly contains what the speaker wants to say, and the audience does not need to rely much on the context, on the shared experience, or on the nonverbal cues to interpret the message. Again, using the case of Jack trying to stop a bunch of students talking in the library. Jack appeals to the high context communication and tries to stop other people talking using eye contact. If the talking students happen to be high context communicators, chances are they will stop talking when they receive Jack's message and understand their voices are too loud for a library setting. However, if the talking students happen to be low context communicators, it will be less likely for them to understand what the unpleasant look is trying to say. To them, a look in their way may be a curious look or a completely random look that does not convey any specific messages. Therefore, it is totally possible that they will ignore the look and continue chit-chatting. In situations like this, another low-context communicator, let's say Jill, might directly tell the students that they are talking too loudly and other people might be affected. I also took this excerpt written by a Taiwanese girl studying in an American college. She said, "In America, sometimes students talk about half the class time. Compared to my classes in Taiwan, if a student asked too many questions or expressed his or her opinions that much, we would consider the person a show-off or insincere." Therefore, as a TA, you may notice that many Taiwanese students do not talk much in class, or some international students are always answering the professor's questions and leading the group discussion, etc., etc. In cases like this, please be aware of the different preferences towards silence and speaking for different cultural groups, and understand silence may not necessarily indicate they do not understand, or they're not paying attention to the class, or they're not interested, etc., etc. It might just mean that they are concerned about how other people might see them if they voice their own answers or opinions. As a TA, it's your job to ensure that such judgment does not happen, and you need to make it extra clear to students who might think this way. You can tell them making errors is an important step in any learning process, and it happens to everyone. You may also use your own experience of making errors to tell them there's no need to be overly concerned about it. Additionally, remind your students that practicing the ability to expressing their own ideas and opinions is also one of the key objectives of college education and training. In group discussion, you may also need to facilitate the conversation among group members a little bit to make sure everyone has an opportunity to chime in and not let one or two persons dominate the entire discussion. Now let's talk about another important distinction in cross-cultural communication, the contact versus non-contact cultures. The concept of contact and non-contact cultures relate to the differences in physical touch and proximity that are normative or preferred in various cultures around the world. Contact cultures are characterized by a higher frequency of touch and closer physical proximity in social interactions. People from contact cultures tend to stand closer to each other, touch more during conversation, and are more comfortable with physical interactions, such as hugs or kisses. Examples of contact cultures include Latin American countries such as Brazil and Argentina, Southern European countries such as Italy, Spain, and France. Non-contact cultures, on the other hand, tend to value more personal space and have less physical contact during social interactions. In these cultures, touching is less frequent, and people maintain a larger physical distance from each other. Typical greetings may involve minimal or no physical contact whatsoever. Examples of non-contact cultures include East Asian countries like South Korea and Japan, as well as Northern European countries like Sweden and Germany. Taiwan is also a non-contact culture. Understanding whether a culture is predominantly contact or non-contact can help in various interpersonal interactions, such as knowing the appropriate way to greet someone, how to conduct oneself in a business meeting, or even how to navigate in public spaces. One of the dimensions that contact and non-contact cultures differ is the amount of eye contact people engage in daily interactions. Specifically, in contact cultures, eye contact is often seen as a sign of sincerity, confidence, and interest. People in these cultures are generally expected to maintain direct eye contact during conversations, as it signifies engagement and respect for the person speaking. Not making eye contact might be interpreted as a sign of dishonesty, disinterest, or even disrespect. This is particularly true in many Western cultures and some Latin American contexts where direct eye contact is encouraged from a very young age. On the other hand, in non-contact cultures, prolonged eye contact might be perceived as invasive, disrespectful, or even aggressive. In many East Asian and some Southeast Asian cultures, for example, too much eye contact can make people feel uncomfortable. It's common for people in these cultures to avert their gaze more often, especially when speaking with someone in a position of authority or someone they respect. This behavior is seen as a sign of respect and humility. For instance, in Japan, direct eye contact is perceived as an invasion of personal space. So when engaged in conversation, it is best to focus on the chin or the tie of the person you're speaking to. Another important difference between contact and non-contact culture is the physical distance people keep from each other. Sometimes referred to as the personal space, it's the bubble around each of us that marks the territory between ourselves and other people. Of course, the universal norm is that relationship matters, right? Naturally, we position ourselves closer to people we know or are familiar with than to people we barely know or complete strangers. But within the same type of relationship, people often stand much closer to each other during conversations in contact cultures, reflecting a comfort with physical closeness. This proximity can express warmth, friendliness, and openness. In these cultures, standing too far away might be perceived as cold, disinterested, or aloof. For example, in countries like Italy, Spain, and many Latin American nations, it's common for people to stand close enough to touch or bump into each other casually during conversations. In contrast, in non-contact cultures, where we typically value a larger personal space bubble, individuals from these cultures prefer to maintain a greater physical distance during interactions to respect personal boundaries and comfort. Standing too close in these cultures might be seen as intrusive or disrespectful. For example, in Japan and Finland, people usually keep a distance of about an arm's length or more in social and business contexts, respecting the need for bigger personal space. What this means to you, the TA, is that you should be more understanding of people's eye contact behaviors and physical proximity choices, and do not interpret the absence of eye contact from, say, a Japanese student as a sign of him or her not respecting you. Or when you're talking face-to-face with your students, you should know the appropriate distance to maintain. Don't be overly surprised if someone from Southern Europe stands closer to you or someone from Japan stands a lot farther from you. You should be more aware of your own eye contact patterns and proximity choices as well. The last difference we wanted to address is the idea of power distance. Power distance in cross-cultural communication refers to the extent to which less powerful members of organizations or institutions, like in a family or in a college, accept and expect the power is distributed unequally. In cultures with high power distance, there is a significant acceptance of hierarchical order and uneven power distribution. Without further justification, authorities and power are seen as facts of life. Organization structures in these cultures tend to be more hierarchical, and individuals are less likely to question the decision of their superiors. Respect for authority is critical value, and interaction between different levels of status or power reflect this asymmetry. Examples of countries with high power distance include Malaysia, Guatemala, and Japan. In contrast, low power distance cultures are characterized by a preference for equality and minimized hierarchical differentiation. In these societies, power relations are more consultative or democratic, and there's greater emphasis on equal rights and opportunities. Superiors are more accessible and interactions are more informal. People in these cultures are more likely to challenge authority and strive for equal say and participation in decisions. Examples would include Denmark, New Zealand, and Sweden. Compared to countries such as the United States, Taiwan is a culture with relatively high power distance. This suggests that in Taiwan there's a significant acceptance of hierarchical structures and an equal distribution of power, both in the workplace and in societies at large. The education system in Taiwan also reflects higher power distance values. Communication is usually more formal when addressing the professors, and indirect communication often used to avoid conflicts and show respect. Professors are highly respected, and their authority is seldom challenged or questioned by the students. The classroom dynamics often involve rote learning and respect for the professor's authority, rather than interactive or inquiry-based learning that might be more common in low-power distance cultures such as the United States. Students usually prefer the learning style they are familiar with when growing up. And for Taiwanese students, it might indicate that they are not super comfortable with discussion-based learning, which combined with their favorable attitude towards silence may very likely lead to Taiwanese students not talking much in discussion. They're also less likely to raise questions to the professor, not to mention different opinions. It's very often that they redirect the question to you, the TA, because you're more approachable, authority-wise, than the professor. While it is a great thing that they are communicating their problems, questions, or concerns, some of them might require you to further communicate or coordinate with your professor. This will be addressed in a separate lecture about upward management. The power distance difference may also affect how the learning performance is assessed in the classroom. Assessment in high power distance cultures may be more standardized and focused on the correct answers rather than process and reasoning. The educational approach might emphasize the correct transmission of knowledge from teacher to the student, with less emphasis on individual interpretation or creative thinking. In contrast, low power distance cultures often use a variety of assessment methods that encourage the creative thinking and individual problem-solving skills. Teachers might use essays or projects that require students to express their own ideas and arguments rather than just reciting facts. Another difference could be about how the feedbacks are given to the students. In high power distance cultures, feedback may be more directive and less participatory. There's often less emphasis on constructive criticism, whereas in low power distance cultures, feedback is very often a two-way process, where the students have a high level of participation. What this means to the TA is that you need to create a welcoming environment and normalize question-asking behaviors. Specifically, you can make it extra clear that all questions are welcome and valued. This can be communicated through verbal encouragement and open body language. Sometimes students might feel hesitant to ask questions. TAs can normalize this by periodically asking if there are any questions and by acknowledging that some concepts may be challenging or confusing and stressing that there are actually no stupid questions in the classroom. So far, we have talked about three big cultural differences: the attitude towards speaking and silence, the contact versus the non-contact cultures, which differ in terms of eye contact and proximity, and power distance. What this 20-ish minute lecture is trying to tell you is that you need to practice your cultural sensitivity and realize people's value system and behaviors might differ due to their unique cultural backgrounds. Not everyone participates in discussion or asks questions the same way. In a university such as NTU, where we have a lot of international students, cultural sensitivity will not only benefit you in teaching and learning, but also in day-to-day interactions and perhaps after you graduate. As a TA, you should respect every student. And that means not only being attentive to the problems and questions they may have, but also understanding their value system and behavioral patterns. Of course, it's also critical that you do not stereotype. Just because someone's from Japan does not necessarily mean he or she likes indirect communication, avoid eye contact, and never voice a different opinion in class. Everyone is different, and cultural background is only one factor that shapes our behavioral patterns. The best advice for any TA that is about to deal with students of different cultural backgrounds is always to be open-minded and maintain constant and consistent communication. When it comes to addressing problems and differences, I'm afraid I have to agree with the Greeks that open communication is always the best way to go.